and welcome to Film Fam, inspired by true events. I'm Heather.
I'm Brian.
And I'm Zoe.
We are the Greys, and we're your Film Fam. For today's companion minisode to our Nosferatu episode, we are so excited to welcome, for a second time, horror writer, playwright, scholar, audio drama producer, Jamieson Ridenhour.
Yay!
Hello.
Welcome to the podcast, Jamieson. Thank you for being our first returning guest.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be back.
Last time we had you on the podcast to talk about Frankenstein, but you're actually more of a vampire guy.
Yeah, I like vampires a lot. I've done a lot of work on vampires.
What's some of the work you've done?
I've done, the biggest work I've done is, I worked with Dracula on my dissertation and on my book on London, in Darkest London. I've got a chapter on Dracula in that. But the most fun I had was editing the Valancourt edition of Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which was just a blast. I did that. That came out in 2009. And then I've also written, I've published an essay on Carmilla and the Swedish vampire film Let the Right One In, which came out in the collection about vampires in 2013. And then I just watched lots of vampire fiction. I've taught Dracula probably 20 times in my career. I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I did a series of lectures about vampires for the North Dakota Humanities Council. It's my jam.
So you're probably the main guy then. Definitely the main guy we know to talk about vampires with.
Back in.
Jamie, I noticed you said let the right one in instead of let me in. I wonder if you had opinions on how it was adapted for the American audience.
I feel, well, Let the Right One In is my favorite vampire film of all time. I think it's amazing. It's closely followed by a 2012 film with Saoirse Ronan called Byzantium by Neil Jordan, which is...
I have not seen that one.
Oh, man. Gemma Atherton and Saoirse Ronan. It is amazing. But Let the Right One In is probably my top one. And I think the adaptation was fine. I like Chloe Moretz. I think it was weird to me, except for a few choices, which I understood. There was big chunks of that film that were, I wouldn't call an adaptation. They were shot-for-shot remakes, like the framing and editing and everything was the same. And I didn't understand why you would...
It was remade?
Yeah.
That segues into our talk about Nosferatu, because we have the original silent film and then we have the remake with Werner Herzog.
Okay, but I love the Werner Herzog remake.
I like that remake. I like both of them, but that is at least going from, it's really changing because it's not a silent film anymore.
Right, and it's in color
and it's Werner Herzog, so it's like a real director trying to bring something.
Is shot by shot.
Yeah, it's not like they made Nosferatu in 1921 and then in 1925 they remade it. I mean, it is sort of the Herzog, the Klaus Kinski version is like an homage to a film that was a classic by that point. So that doesn't bother me quite as much.
No, I like both of them, and I like that they both exist.
As someone who just kind of worked on, not like adapting, but working on Carmilla, I mean, I don't know, it's a translation, it's a,
No, it's just an edition. I just wrote the footnotes and put all the contextual stuff and wrote the introduction.
Right. Well, as someone who just worked on it, were you in on that, did you know about that YouTube series version of Carmilla that came out? Because I was really into that for a while. Like, before I read your edition, which I picked up at a bookstore and was like, I know him.
That's so cool.
I was just looking for Carmilla. I had no idea. But I love that because it was really adding something. Yeah, and it was contextualizing it for a contemporary audience and bringing vampires in. I don't know. I think there's something about... it's very easy to do queer readings of vampire texts because, I don't know, do you want to tell me why?
Because they're queer.
Right.
I mean, it's easy to do a queer reading of Carmilla because they're explicitly lesbian. But yeah, I think the Carmilla YouTube series was great. I mean, obviously it wasn't scary and it wasn't meant to be. It wasn't professionally produced, but it was good enough. I really enjoyed it, and it did. One of the things that I feel like adaptations ought to do. It made you go buy the 1872 Carmilla, which you've now read. So rock on, right? No, I love that adaptation. I mean, I think vampires are transgressive. And sometimes that means queer. It's more explicitly queer in the latter part of the 20th century into now than it was earlier on. But even Dracula can be read pretty queer in places. The book that does this really well, that explores this really well, up through 96 when it came out, is by Nina Arbach. It's called Our Vampires Ourselves. And Arbach's thesis is basically that vampires have staying power because they adapt to whatever the cultural fear is at the time. And so Dracula is about transgressive sexuality. It's in the late Victorian era, and there's a lot of Lucy's pretty much punished for being promiscuous, even though she's not actually promiscuous, but she thinks about it, which is enough apparently. And then you get all kinds of different permutations throughout the 20th century, and you get sort of self-involved, individualistic vampires in Anne Rice in the mid-70s, and you get queer vampires, explicitly queer vampires in Poppy Z. Bright's Lost Souls in 1992, when thought or cultural ideas about homosexuality are bubbling more to the surface at that point. So we just kind of change what our vampires are, and sometimes they go flaccid and ridiculous like in Twilight, but for the most part they're reflecting real fears, but those fears change. The things that we are kind of anxious about as a culture, the vampire tends to reflect.
So What do you think they were to Murnau? What do you think it was in Nosferatu that was the cultural fear at the time?
I think with Murnau, it's not as much about vampires as it is about German expressionism in general. And so after World War I, a lot of horror movies deal with grotesque characters and deformed characters and bodies that are misshapen or deformed or somehow. And that is there were a lot of people like that. I mean, after World War I, there were a lot of people returning from the war that had been horribly maimed. And there's sort of, particularly in America, not something that you talked about. You wanted to celebrate that we won the war, and let's don't talk about the horrible consequences that we've had. So you see this eruption of films that deal with deformed bodies and bodies that don't look the way they're supposed to. This is the rise of Lon Chaney Sr., the man of 1,000 faces, who always kind of warped himself somehow. And I feel like the same thing is going on. Germany is, and Eastern Europe both have just had the shit kicked out of them. And they're expressing surrealism in general deals a lot with half bodies and bodies that aren't quite where they're supposed to be, and even like Picasso, who's starting at the same time. That's what I think is going on. And I could be wrong.
I like that idea.
No, there's a long history of genre art making, I don't know, I guess heroes and villains, according to what people are scared of right then.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've got Godzilla and so many of the Marvel heroes and villains reacting to radiation after World War II. But then when they make the Tobey Maguire version of Spider-Man, he's bitten by a genetically modified spider.
Right.
It's I don't know. It's CRISPR. It's something that people now might be afraid of.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting though, because vampires are what we're afraid of, but also people want to become vampires because of the immortality and in some cases the sexuality or the raw strength, while at the same time it's dealing with their fears.
When I write about vampires, one of the central things I talk about, particularly in books like Carmilla, is the tension between attraction and repulsion, which is kind of at the heart of the vampire myth. For exactly the same reason that you're saying there. There's a scene early in Dracula where Jonathan Harker is trapped in the castle, and the three vampire women come to him, and he he pretty much pretends to be asleep, like he doesn't know what they're going to do, but they're sexy women who appeared out of nowhere, and he knows he's not supposed to be in this part of the castle, and he literally says, I waited in shivering anticipation. So like I'm not supposed to be here, and he could have got up and left, but he's like, let's wait and see what happens. And
but anticipation isn't fear.
No,
it's not like I waited terrified of what they're going to do.
No, it's like, oh, let me see what I'm, oh, help, I'm at your mercy. Let me see let me see what's about to happen.
Shivering anticipation.
Shivering anticipation. Yeah,
it
exactly.
Could be read both ways.
Yeah, and Carmilla does the same thing. At the end of Carmilla, Lara, the protagonist, says that she sometimes imagines she hears the footstep of Carmilla at the door, and it's really hard to tell whether she hears it in dread or hopefulness. So that's very much part of the vampire. I don't think it's part of Nosferatu, though.
Well, because there's very few moments where he is that, like, Byronic Dracula figure. He's not sexy. I mean, he's animalistic. He's really not sexy. There is, like, one scene where he's, like, drinking her blood from her neck for, like, an uncomfortable amount of time to see on screen.
Right.
Like, truly like just so long. And it's, like... I think there is something about like the feeding that it always feels kind of, it's intimate. It's like very intimate, but the way he is made is never, sometimes I'm like, oh, I pity him and I care for him at times, but I'm never like, man, I got the hots for Nosferatu.
Yeah, like, nobody does. And Nina, the character Nina, Greta, what's her name? Greta.
Greta.
The actress Greta.
But all I can think of is Greta Gerwig. And obviously that's not it. Yeah, I can't remember the actress's name. But she's also not a typical vampire victim because she doesn't have that attraction repulsion. She is actually a lot more empowered than a lot of other women in vampire films. She wants to kill him. And she is disgusted by him and repulsed by him. So, yeah, that feels missing. He feels very much a part of the folkloric vampire and not the Byronic vampire.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Greta Schroeder.
Yeah.
Just so we...
What did you say?
Greta Schroeder.
Greta Schroeder, thank you. Yes, that's correct.
That's one of the things we talked about in the podcast is like the different lines, the Dracula line and then the Nosferatu line. And you see them in different types of movies now, like 30 Days of Night or... in What We Do in Shadows, the Peter character, rather than he being like sexy, Byronic, long hair with the cape, he's kind of like a rat.
Yeah, it's a completely different line of vampire. And the so the folkloric vampire, I don't know, how much do you want to know about the folkloric vampire?
I mean,
let's do it.
Please tell me.
Yes.
So I keep referring to books, but the book you want then is by Paul Barber. It's called Vampires, Burial, and Death. And it sums up a much older book that you probably don't want to read, and I've read it, so I promise you probably don't want to read it. By a monk in the 18th century wrote a book called The Revenants, I think it's called. And his name was Augustin Calmet. And so what happened in the 18th century, in the age of the Enlightenment, there were persistent ideas from rural areas of vampires. And we think they're probably in response to plagues. Someone dies of a plague and then lots of other people die from the same thing. And the rumor goes around that he's coming back from the dead and whatever. So in an effort to quell these ridiculous rumors, people from the enlightened cities sent out doctors and people who were affirmed by the court to be witnesses to prove that this is wrong. And so they would go out to these rural villages in Eastern Europe largely, and where they were going to exhume a vampire so they could witness and say, okay, here we are, we're the scientists, this is how you're wrong. And they all came back and said, oh my God, it's true. We were there and we saw the vampires and they were real. Because what happens to a corpse when it's in the ground is, and this is fun, rigor mortis fades away, which they apparently didn't, a lot of people didn't know at that point. Blood settles in various places, sometimes around the mouth. your tissues shrink as moisture goes away, so it looks like your teeth have gotten longer. It looks like your hair has grown. It looks like your fingernails have grown. And the body bloats with gas. So this is pretty gross, but this is what happens. So you open a coffin expecting to find a vampire. You find a guy that may have moved because the gas moves the body a little bit. He's got blood around his mouth. His teeth have grown long and sharper. So you stake him, and the staking actually forces gas up through the vocal cords, and he groans, and blood explodes from him.
Yeah, okay, so like, you're in that time period. You're like, yeah, the confirmation.
We just killed that vampire.
Just killed that vampire. So you had all these like official guys go down there, doctors go down to see, we're going to disprove this, and they all came back saying, oh my God, they're right. So this monk, Augustin Calmet, writes this long, detailed book listing all these different incidences where this has happened. And he's writing it because he's trying to reconcile his faith in God with what he seems to be scientific proof of the undead. And he doesn't really resolve it. He writes it in Latin. 100 years later, in 1850, it gets translated into English by a guy, I swear to God, named Henry Christmas, the Reverend Henry Christmas. And Sheridan Le Fanu owned a copy. We know this. And it was a bestseller for some reason. People really dug it in the 1850s. And so a lot of people read it, and it became this sort of undercurrent under the Byronic hero. It became this big inspiration for another genre of vampire fiction, which was the nasty Varney the Vampire was a really popular.
Right.
Yeah, so Varney was a walking corpse, right? They're much more like Night of the Living Dead. So that's what Nosferatu is, I think.
We're talking about plague a lot when we're talking about it, because he's so associated in the movie with plagues and with rats, and I mean, it felt pertinent now. I don't know if the new wave of vampire movies is going to be, coming back to a plague.
Nosferatu was right after the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
And now, and there was some analysis about the appearance of the character itself as looking rat-like, and there being so many rats as a central part of the film in order to make that connection with between plague and vampires.
And it's a traditional connection too, going back to the original ideas. But yeah, it was the perfect time for it. So yeah, that's absolutely operative, I think. And he looks like a rat, and he also looks like a plague victim, right? He's emaciated, and he's again, he's a walking corpse. He's nobody's suave lady killer, right?
Right, which is an interesting take on for like how much they were like,
stealing.
Murnau had to change things, but really didn't want to, and like changed a minor amount, not enough to not get sued and have all the copies. Almost all the copies destroyed, but he, that's a big change to me from the Dracula of the books. I mean, I think about like my favorite scene in Nosferatu in both versions is that scene at the table, right? And then he cuts himself, and Nosferatu, or Count Orlok, goes to Jonathan and is like overcome. And
Thomas Hutter in this one.
Thomas Hutter,
the Jonathan character.
I'm, and it is animalistic in a way that I think is like only one facet of the Dracula from the novel. There are definitely animalistic moments of the Dracula from the novel. I mean, when I read it, I like knew all this vampire stuff. I'd been watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer since I was legitimately probably 2 years old. There's video proof.
And Buffy had the Byronic
the master
type.
Oh, and the master.
Also,
the master, right?
Yeah, the master.
But there were. But I was shocked in the book when I saw like I don't know, stuff I had never seen in a vampire before, of like climbing up the wall on all fours. Like I was like, that's frightening. Like, and going into Nosferatu, like I feel like that's more of the vampire that we see in Nosferatu, like this, almost like an animal.
He's scary. He's a scary.
Right,
even now
scary.
He's scary. Yeah. I agree, and I think people that haven't read the original novel Dracula don't realize how unsuave and he's Byronic.
He has a long white mustache,
and his teeth stick down over his lips, and they're really clear how bad his breath is. They say that several times. His breath reeks. because if all you eat is blood, of course. And he's dead. But so yeah, he's not Gary Oldman, from the 1993 right. Dracula. That's not what he is at all. But he's also not quite. He also can pass, right? He can walk around in society and be okay. And I don't think Count Orlok could.
No, there's a hilarious little moment of him in Nosferatu of Count Orlok carrying his coffin out, and, like, looking from side to side, like, where do I go with this?
Right,
and awkwardly walking off. Like, he could not exist in society.
No, but he exists enough that he, like we said, he is basically the one classic horror monster who really gets involved in real estate. That he's dealing in his real estate, which you don't really see, like the Mummy or Frankenstein's monster buying real estate.
But that's from the book. Jonathan Harker was a real estate agent. That's why he was in Transylvania, to sell him a house. Which
I think that's great.
I do too. I think Nosferatu is. To be the age it is a surprisingly creepy film. Because you don't Stephen Cohen's monster theory from the late 90s, which is really great, and he's got 7 theses on how monsters function, and basically has to do with them being liminal, with them standing in they're not dead and they're not alive. They're not they're in kind of an in between space, and one of those places that they're in between is they're right at the threshold of becoming a new thing. So when Poppy Z. Brite writes Lost Souls in the early 90s, and the vampires are all kind of gay and gender fluid emo kids or goth kids, that's something that was culturally anxious at the moment, but was about to shift into a little bit more acceptance or a little bit wider kind of ideas. So, and the same with like the sexuality of Dracula in the 1890s, that we get these monstrous representations of the things that are about to transform.
Well, no wonder then that vampires are so queer, or so, like, no wonder, like I as a kid and lots of people I know were like obsessed with vampires. Maybe it's, coming out of, if vampires are always associated with the new thing that people are afraid of, but is on the cusp of becoming societally accepted. Like, there's a lot of people that are like, fuck yes. Like, okay, I love it. Like, if this is your fear, like, this is I'll totally, like, embrace it.
Do you have any shows or anything coming out soon that you could tell us about?
We are entering the second half of season 4 of Palimpsest right now. We're coming out every 2 weeks. So we're in production-wise, we're about ready to record the last 2 episodes, but I think episode 6 just came out. And then after that, if you're local to Asheville, North Carolina, my play Bloodbath opens in October 8th.
Oh, so exciting!
Yeah, that's the next thing.
I want to see it.
Come on down.
Yeah.
Maybe I will.
Road trip. Yeah.
Or you could live.
We might. I don't know if we're. I don't know. We might be doing that. I'm not sure. That the theater company I work with pivoted really quickly to live streaming during the pandemic, and did a pretty good job with it. So I don't know if they're going to continue to live stream or not.
If you can hook that up, we will help cross-promote.
Okay, I'll let you know.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Like Film Fam, inspired by true events, subscribe to hear more stories that inspired our favorite films.
For photos and links from the show and other shenanigans, follow us on Instagram at FilmFamPodcast, on Twitter at FilmFam_podcast, and on Facebook at FilmFam Inspired by True Events.
If you have any questions, comments, corrections, or films whose inspiration you would like us to explore, you can email us at filmfampodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you all for listening. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.